Hello everyone, I'm Rob Gordon. I'm a psychologist that's worked for 30 years with disaster recovery in Victoria and Australia and New Zealand. And I'm wanting to share some of my learnings and observations with people in Mallacoota who I enjoyed so much meeting in January and February, and hope to come down and visit you all again soon. But particularly thinking about this really difficult time about 6 months down the track. It's so common that the 6 month mark is a low point. When I say 6 months, I've been somewhere between 4 and 8 months in a mid-year period, which for us is associated with winter, which has its own challenges. And I want to just share some of the things I've tried to understand about this, why it is so almost predictable. Even comes up in the research that there's often a peak of difficulties for people around about 6 months. And I think that the simple conclusion is that I think a lot of people can really function pretty well in stress mode for a while, but after a few months they start getting tired, and around about the 6 month mark most people are tired, and maybe even the people who are there in the community with us who we look to for support are also tired, so everyone's tired. And probably around about this time, the people who are outside the community who weren't involved in the disaster have moved on a long way with their lives and are not quite as available, don't necessarily understand how long it takes. And I want to just speak about this for a moment before thinking about ways in which it's possible to try and reduce this impact. There are a whole range of different reactions that occur around about this time. You know, we have this concept of stress, which is a very general idea that we're just under enormous pressure. We're responding to demands that demand more energy and output and attention and emotion than we can conveniently give. And so we have a motivation to do that, which just switches on our stress response and pushes us to do it. We have to do it. And most people just do it. But this involves a kind of shutting down of the usual processes by which we manage and regulate our reactions to things. So ideally in a good environment, in a comfortable situation, we notice when we're starting to feel tired, we take a rest. When we're hungry, we eat, and so on. When we're mentally full up, we take some time out. The only problem is that when stress mode, we don't have that opportunity, we don't have the leisure. So we keep going, and even when we do rest, we can't stop thinking. Funny sort of reaction when you're worried about things. You don't want to stop thinking about them, even though you can't solve any problems now, but you keep turning them over as if I put this down, I'll forget it, I won't be able to do it. And so this strong emotional attachment to keeping the stress ideas in front of your mind. And so we find that after a while you get this funny little frazzled feeling where you can't quite work out what's important and what's not. The only way we can get things into perspective and prioritize what's important here is by looking at them in a much broader context, a much broader picture. So I can only work out that this issue is more important than that issue, which maybe is right in front of me. And I know this is the thing I need to go for, because when we think quite some way down the track, it's this issue that's going to be important rather than this one that happens to be in front of me. And I need a perspective for that. We lose perspective in stress. Stress is about being able to cope with an immediate demand that's right in front of us. And so this is the big struggle, I think, with rebuilding and recovery. You know, farmers have said to me that they've looked back maybe a year or two later at all the work they did in the first few months and realised that it wasn't thought out. There were opportunities that were missed. There were creative chances where they could have changed things, and they really just put all their focus on recreating what was there, only to find that it doesn't quite work and they maybe even have to redo it all. People have rebuilt their houses and then looked back and thought, well, I could have had all sorts of other options here. I could have changed the design. I could have made a nicer house, or, you know, all sorts of things. It's a very important thing to value that precious ability for creativity and looking to the future, building for the future, creating a lifestyle for the future, rather than just rebuilding the past. To do that, we have to get out of stress. But there's a couple of other things that keep us in the stress. One is the trauma reactions that come from the fear. The fear, not necessarily of what actually happened, but the fear of what we thought was going to happen at crucial moments, where people got themselves ready for terrible outcomes that mercifully we were largely spared in these fires. But they are things which bring home to us certain fundamental truths that we don't normally think about. The value of life, for instance, the value of our loved ones. What does our house mean when we thought we were going to lose it and we didn't? How's it affected our attachments? I remember a woman being told on the night of Ash Wednesday that her house was gone. She spent the whole night grieving and being sad. She loved her house. And then when it was safe, a day or so later, she and her husband drove out around the corner through the blackened trees, came to their building site, and there was the house, absolutely untouched. She said, I'm ashamed to admit it, but the first feeling I had was one of disappointment. I'd let it go. Now you can imagine that if a person doesn't stop and think about that and process the fact that she's let go of loss and has opened herself to a new future without it, now she has to take it in, back in. She has to reattach herself. And if she recognises that's what's happened, she's able to admit to herself she's had this very surprising feeling, she can get about a process of reconnecting. I know that the same thing happens between people when one of them thinks that another one's going to die, or somebody thinks they're going to die and not see their loved ones anymore. But it doesn't have to be so dramatic. Often profound and traumatic experiences, extreme experiences, will have an effect on relationships, have an effect on relationships between children and parents. I can think of the parents who put their children in the house on Black Saturday and said to the oldest one, look after the youngest ones, keep them safe. Dad and I will be okay outside. We've got our plan, everything will work. And then, of course, the parents were busy for a couple of hours while, of course, a firestorm raged around. That child who was put in charge, as far as I understood, and I followed them through for a couple of years, never really forgave the parents for, as she experienced it, abandoning them. Now, the parents saw it as they kept them safe. And this was a really big tension and stress in those relationships between the child and the parents. And I think really, unfortunately, by the time I heard about this, I think I'd lived with it for quite some time. I think it would have been great if they'd opened up and talked about it. I find this is one of the things that is happening around about the 6-month mark. We know that often people who've been carrying traumatic experiences, traumatic memories, traumatic fearfulness, inability to sleep well, inability to feel safe, startling, feeling uncomfortable about smoke or whatever the specific triggers might be, are often able to, just through strength of character, put it aside for a certain period of time and get on with what they have to do, especially if they're involved in the community or rebuilding. But it takes a lot of energy and they start to get very tired. And when we get tired and we're trying to fend off bad experiences, we get irritable. We start to react to each other. Because in this stress state we become self-centered and skinless. There's nothing between me and what's coming to me from the environment. There's no secure fabric of assumptions and expectations that everything's okay and I know how it's going to be in the future. It's all uncertain. It's like losing the skin. So we become hypersensitive, irritable, impatient, and that creates friction in relationships when we most want to be able to talk together and share and process these experiences. We use this word processing, don't we? That means talking around and looking at different aspects, most of all listening to each other, trying to enter into how does somebody else see it. You know, change doesn't come about by telling people to be different. It comes about by helping them unload the experience that they're carrying. And then, like putting a bucket of water you've been carrying too far down and shaking your arm and loosening up and taking with the other arm, and you can get a different hold on it. And then maybe you see it differently. And we need to do that with our experience. Try and just put them out there. And the place where they'll be held is between us in a conversation. Just put it out there. Don't hurry too much to solve a problem. Just let's work out what it is first. And very often people will see it differently when they've slept on it. Very important to remember, sleeping helps us to connect things up. This has now been shown with the scientists with experiments that people actually are better at solving a problem when they've spent time on the problem and been able to have a good sleep, and particularly a good dreaming period on that problem. They're better able to solve it than people who haven't had a good dreaming episode. So sleeping on things, it's not just a saying, it's a terribly important part of the process. But when we're stressed, of course, we don't sleep. When we're traumatized, we have a lot of trouble going to sleep. And what we notice is that with trauma, what happens is that people go off to sleep and then they wake up as soon as they go into their dreaming state because they revisit the trauma. So the process of talking about the trauma and trying to settle the emotions down by accepting them, which means we need other people to be with us when we're sad and frightened and just calmly reassure us that it's over now and we're where we are. Sometimes we, of course, need all the techniques that trained people can give us, but such an important part is this ability to listen. I think we get very stressed listening to each other because we feel we've got to solve it, or we get very worried when people shed some tears or whatever. In my experience, people often are tearful as a way of expressing in their body the emotion. And that's a very healthy process and helps a person change the way they understand it. The only time we need to be worried about tears is if it's uncontrolled crying that doesn't settle. And that means there's something with attention needed. And so I think it's such an important thing to see that with the stress and the trauma that's been held back, there's a process going on that's using up our resources. We're getting tired. And there's one other process I want to mention, and that is grief. Grief is the emotion we have when we've lost something important to us. We normally think about that as our loved ones, our families, our pets, our houses, but we can keep going, can't we? Anything that I have an emotional attachment to, I will grieve when I lose my neighbours, even if they've just moved out and their house is burnt down, so they're not living here anymore. Maybe the view, the environment, the nature, the wild animals. I didn't know them personally, but I love to watch them moving through the forest, or the birds. Or these are part of the furniture of our lives. And we don't really know what things like that mean to us often until they're gone, because we took them for granted. So much in this area of trauma and disaster has to do with the loss of things we took for granted. And it's often a hard and painful experience to say, oh, and there's that, oh, and there's this, and there's this. People say, they catch themselves thinking, yes, I've got one of those, I'll go and get it, and oh no, I haven't, I lost it. When people move into their new house, they go to the cupboard. They make the mistake of having a house with the same sort of cupboard. They go to the cupboard to get something and realise it's the wrong cupboard, the wrong house, they've lost it. And in this curious sort of way, it's as though we have to take an emotional inventory of all the things we lost. And we can't do that straight away. It happens progressively, probably over years. And I think it's really important that we understand that the sadness that comes from that is the natural way of adjusting to the loss, accepting it, and allowing ourselves to then open ourselves to what will come in its place. Often we can't connect to what's replaced it until we have been able to let go of the old things. So it's this process of letting go. So there are so many things that we grieve. And one of the risks is that we try and fend off these painful feelings and hang on to the past. And then there are a couple of ways we can try and do that. We can wish it hadn't happened. And of course, in ideal situations, we can indulge in wishes and imaginations and so on, and they're very satisfying. I can imagine how nice it would be to, I don't know, drive a beautifully expensive car or go for an expensive holiday, and I could look at pictures of, I was going to say ocean cruises, but maybe that's not very tactful at the moment. But you know what I mean? We can daydream about these things, and there's a certain amount of enjoyment. Wishes and fulfilling wishes and imagining is a very important part of our motivation. I want to save up for something that I've seen that somebody else had. I wish I had one, and so I'm going to save up, and then when I get it, I feel very happy. So we've got this whole really important process that leads us to achieve things in our life. But when loss comes, we can hijack that wish process. Instead of achieving things that we didn't have, it can be to try and get something back that's gone. And what we find is we keep trying to get it back, and we keep discovering it's gone. It's not coming back. And so we keep falling over this painful experience of loss again. And it's very, very painful. It's not a productive way of doing it. It's so important that what people will say who've had tragic losses in their lives is that it may take them a long time, but it's at the point at which they say, I finally accept that I've lost it. That's when I notice the turning point. I start to look to the future. A second thing we can do to try and fend off loss is try to just bury ourselves in activity and not think about it. And, you know, I've talked to people who did that, and then it's when they move into their new house, if they lost their house, that they actually find themselves beginning the grieving for all the things they've lost. And with loss, we can also just try and not think about it. Do the same thing I mentioned with trauma, just simply put it in a cupboard and block it and not think about it, and busy myself with all the stuff I need to do. But that takes energy. We have energy for stress, energy for managing traumatic reactions that are hanging around, and it takes a lot of energy to grieve, because there's a lot of emotional stuff going on inside us. and physical energy, not just emotional energy, psychological energy, but physical energy. And so around about, let's say, 4 to 8 months, most people start getting very, very tired. Not so tired they can't keep going with their physical responsibilities most of the time, their jobs and so on, but a deep emotional fatigue starts to build up. And if we're not careful, that then puts us in this more self-centered state where we want to look after ourselves, and we get irritable and tired and impatient and wanting to be understood. But in fact, everyone wants to be understood. I don't have the patience and the time and the energy to enter into your point of view when in fact I'm struggling with myself. So we get this tension that builds up. People sometimes use a metaphor, an image. Somebody used it recently with me in a session I had with a group, and they talked about the wheels falling off. You know, we have that metaphor, don't we? Around about 6 months, the wheels fell off. Well, that's a metaphor to say I couldn't do it anymore. There's a lot of reports, particularly by community members in disasters, that they describe a point where they just couldn't deal with things anymore. They came to the end of their tether. I always quote the example of the woman who didn't lose her house, didn't suffer any material loss, but was central to the recovery of her community and did heroic work for her community for a long time. And then she was very well connected, and people would always call in and want to visit her and have cups of tea. And she said she got to a point where she just couldn't bear to see anyone or talk to anyone. And in the morning when her kids had gone to school, she lived in a small community, everyone knew her. The only thing she could do to get a bit of peace and quiet is she'd go and shut herself in the walk-in wardrobe, because she knew pretty soon friends and neighbours would come knocking on the door, and when she didn't answer, they knew the car was in the garage. They'd go around, they'd peer in the windows and knock, "Are you there, Mary? Mary, are you there? Are you there, Mary? Are you all right?" And she'd say, "I just have to stay in there until they went away." And she was just really so she couldn't cope with other people bringing their issues. Now, I once was in a car driving down the freeway at 100 kilometres per hour, and a wheel, just one wheel, fell off the car in front, which happened to be a recently purchased second-hand car. And of course, it was dusk in the winter, 100 kilometres an hour on the freeway. And of course, this wheel came bouncing down and hit the front of my car and went over the top and bounced on down. Luckily, it didn't kill anyone, but it might have. Now, that car had driven probably about 15 or 20 kilometres from the used car dealer onto the freeway and down the freeway about 5 kilometres before it fell off. Now, it doesn't just suddenly fall off, does it? It starts to get loose. The nuts hadn't been put on, tightened up properly. And so it would have been wobbling. It would have been wobbling and getting looser and looser and looser. It was a back wheel. So I suspect the person driving the car seemed to be quite an inexperienced driver. And you could see when the wheel fell off, you had this huge thing of sparks in the darkening winter evening, and it made his way over to the side of the road. You see, he was an inexperienced driver who couldn't tell that the wheel was in trouble and going to come off. Probably never had it before. I've never had a wheel fall off. So we don't know what that feels like. Well, the same token, most people have never reached the point that Mary reached, where she just couldn't cope with anyone. And so one of the most important things is, how do we keep track of ourselves? Well, we know that all these stress responses, grief, trauma, general stress, shut down the feedback system. We're not thinking about ourselves. We're just trying to deal with what's there and dealing with it and dealing with it. And as we get very tired, this is a sign that the nuts are getting loose, the forces that hold things together. It's very, very important to give full attention to fatigue. Perhaps if there's one thing that you need to make sure you attend to is fatigue, particularly if you're not getting sleep. There are all sorts of good basic sleep hygiene processes. I'm sure there's many internet sites that will give you advice about how to compose yourself for sleep. Start halfway through the evening. Don't watch screens because they stimulate. The light stimulates the waking daylight nerve system, which produces the staying awake chemicals. So no screens for several hours before you go to bed. I know we're all addicted to them, but it's not good for our health, and all the physiology's been worked out. And instead, you might listen to music, or if you read a book or a magazine or anything other than that brilliant light coming into your eyes. We want dullness so that we absorb, and the darkness or the lack of light starts producing the sleep chemicals that prepare us for sleep. There's two systems. And if we get tired but we watch our screens, these two systems are going to fight against each other. Take warm baths, eat, foods of the right sort. Maybe take a bit of exercise, unwind, sit around quietly towards the end of the evening instead of rushing around trying to do your tax and bills and fill out forms. Don't do it for the last hour. Unwind. Treat yourself like, a 4-year-old kid who has to be put to bed carefully and read a story and tucked up and chatted to for a while so they get a proper sleep habit. Do it to each other and do it to yourselves. Anything that you can do to recruit that energy is so essential. I like to say that anything that loosens us up gets us out of stress. Stress is like a cramping. It's shown in muscular tension, but it's also shown in mental tension. One of the important ways of building our energy in this state of stress, we need to think about how we get energy from each other. There's nothing like a really warm, enjoyable conversation to help us feel invigorated. And this will translate into physical energy. So along with sleep and we can throw in diet and exercise and all the good healthy things that we need to make a decision to practice. So we need to try and create an environment where we can simply exchange views and try to understand that unless we really give attention to each other, we don't understand the other person. We get locked up in our own egocentric state. We need to make a decision to just listen to each other. And I think this is such an important thing because actually it's when we talk that we hear ourselves talking. That's when we start to get a perspective and perhaps realize what we're going through. And we'll only talk if somebody listens. It's one of the most valuable things you can do is to give someone your full attention. Your children, for a start. Your partner, for a start. You may feel full up and you can't do it right now, but try and actually just spend time with them and slowly get into a space where you can just be there, and don't try and solve any problems at that time. Just exchange views. They will go in and allow some kind of creative process to take place. It takes time. We need energy for it, but we get a lot of energy back from it. I think what's also important is understanding that there's a lot of loneliness in being egocentric because you've only got yourself to look after you. And as we get into that state, which is absolutely central to stress, it's what makes stress adaptive is that we focus on our problems and deal with them. It's when that goes on, it becomes progressively more isolating. And so people start to feel incredibly lonely. I remember a very sad poem that a woman wrote and put in the newsletter I made tremendous attempts to track it down because it was so moving. I never managed to find it, where she wrote this poem about being in a caravan on their burnt out block and how the trees were all black and the night was black and it was black inside the caravan, and she's lying in bed with her back to her husband, and there's a blackness between them because they're not talking, and it mirrored the blackness in her heart. You know, she went right through this. The whole environment is... Now, what brings light is talk. Talk shows us things. It shows us the mind of another person. It's like shining a light. It's like opening a window when we talk about things, when we describe them. And we just try to put aside what we need and just try to understand the other person. And pretty soon there'll be an exchange. And when that exchange happens, there'll be warmth and there'll be emotions. And one of the things we have to recognize is that what makes us very alone is that no one else is having our experience. So yes, a couple need to talk, but perhaps the husband needs to talk to men to understand what it's like to be a man. And the woman needs to talk to a woman to understand what it's like to be a woman. There are, groups that the people who've lost houses perhaps need to be able to talk to other people who've lost houses. And the people who didn't lose houses need to talk to the other people who didn't lose houses about how bad they feel and how guilty they feel and how they feel they don't really have a right to say, look, I'm struggling too. So that we create, in sociology, they're called reference groups. A group that I can refer to that helps to make sense of my experience. We all need reference groups. That's what we have in a good functioning community and friendship network. People that we can compare our experiences to. And it comes back to the question of what's normal. If we don't communicate, we don't realise that our experiences are normal. Of course, being normal for 6 months after a disaster doesn't mean they're good. It's normal to be lonely and sad and exhausted and pessimistic and irritable and struggling to see the future and so on. It's normal, but it's not reasonable. What we have to do is recognise we must put our energy into the things that seem insubstantial in the future, the goals, the plans, what kind of a life do we have, not hurrying through to just fix everything up now. Try to stabilise things so we've got time to plan, because we don't get many moments in life where we are going to plan our future. But this is one of them. And what supports do we need to actually get the space to do that? What relationships do we need to call on? One of the factors of resilience is this idea in resilience that originally comes, as far as I can see, from the Latin word for reeds in the river. As the reeds get flexed and flattened, and then they spring back when the water's passed. This idea of springing back, not bouncing, because the ball bounces. That's got nothing to do with the ground. Doesn't matter what it bounces. But the reeds are embedded in the ground, and they flex, and then recreate their form, because something is held, something's twisted and bent, but hasn't broken, and so can be reactivated. So what do we need to reactivate that will actually serve our future? And we need to work together on that. What do we need to reactivate about Mallacoota, about our family, about our own personal life? What are the important values? And maybe we can sit down and think about them, but often we find that in a conversation. Or journaling is really important, is getting it out and expressing it in some way. There's been research on how valuable journaling is for people after disasters. And so it's about talking and listening. And as soon as we find common points, we depersonalize it. Depersonalize, as I said, it's just not a unique thing to me. Other people are feeling this. Other people are feeling guilty. Other people are feeling sad, pessimistic. But I see them as good people. I need to tell them that. And so on. This exchange needs to happen. I think it's really important to come back to that idea of the wheels falling off. I think it's so important we pull over when the wheel is wobbling well before it falls off. And if we don't know what it feels like to have a wheel wobbling with loose nuts, we need to go to someone who does know. If the car's not working right, it doesn't feel like sitting on the road right, it's struggling a bit, you know. If we're feeling tired, if we don't bounce back, if we're not sleeping, these are really important factors where we need to access the services and supports. We know that people that use the services available, often for the first time in their lives, do much better, and they do it before they have a crisis. There's plenty of people that will have their crisis 3, 4, 5 years down the track, and that's when the wheels do fall off. It's a really important thing. Everybody is going to be tested by this, so it's so important to use the supports before you actually need them. That means rebuilding your energy before you have to, taking time out. So many people have told me one of the best things they ever did after Black Saturday was get away for a weekend from the area, out of blackened trees, somewhere where they spend a weekend with, you know, of course we've got COVID, but when you can, spend a weekend with people who are not talking about fires all the time. Of course, this is not the time you'll communicate your experience, but you get back in touch with normal routines. Then you need other groups. Maybe those friends will be a reference group for the non-disaster qualities of your life, but then you need other people who are the reference group for your various aspects of your disaster experience. And you probably need lots of different groups. So participating in community events is so important. Not everyone did that before, and not everyone needed to, but we know that people who do it afterwards will do better and do easier and make it more creative. One last point I wanted to make is that stress thinking is judgmental thinking. It has this business of ranking things in order of their severity. That if you don't have my problem, I don't see you've got a problem. You should see what it's like from me. This person is not entitled to assistance. They didn't have that problem. These are very, very common. There's almost intuitively obvious ways of thinking, but it's all based on the false idea that all the problems are out in the open, we can see them. They're not. Some of the most complex problems are the emotional meaning things have about what people thought was going to happen to them. These are not things that people even know how to explain. So I think I've learned that I've sometimes seen people that I couldn't really understand their reaction at all, and it seemed to me very exaggerated and maybe not justified. If you spend time and sit down and listen to a person and hear their life story and what everything meant and how it occurred, you realise, my goodness, I understand exactly why you're reacting the way you are. Everyone is justified for reacting the way they are if you knew the whole story. Sometimes they don't know it themselves. We don't need to know the story to take it on trust that this person's struggling, and they're all part of the community. The greatest resource is the community itself, and that's woven together with these communication links of understanding and activating the very same care, empathy, commitment that gives rise to the guilt when things happen. And so we need to bring that back to that positive glue that holds communities together, and that doesn't seem to be there, but the whole community holds together. And to really value the two things that I come back to again and again to talk about as the ways of relieving stress. One is pleasure, enjoyment, satisfaction, happiness. All of these emotions recharge us deep down in our bones, if that's where our energy comes from. And the more the enjoyment goes to really meaningful things, the better it is. It's biologically essential to try and get some enjoyment every day. Do things that are meaningful, satisfying, that give you a bit of happiness as often as you can. Put time and energy and effort and, if necessary, money into having some fun and enjoyment. We unwind steadily if we don't have any enjoyment. And it's really important to work out who you do that with and how you do it together. And there are lots of different forms, but look for it as to what you can do under the current circumstances. And the other one is leisure. To set time aside where there's no commitments, no obligations, where you just have time out. And discipline yourself. You're not going to look at emails. You're not going to answer letters. You're not going to fill out forms. You're not going to look at social media, whatever. You just be. Be with other people, or maybe be alone if you feel that. And give each other in a family that time, that leisure, and help each other, because that's how we get back in touch with each other. Very simple things like allow time for daydreaming and imagination, and that'll bring humour in it. It's so important to get that perspective through relinquishing, letting go of the problem solving and just daydreaming, speculating and imagining. It's the positive side of what we wish. And I think that it's equally important to then remember that what held us together in the community are the patterns and the rhythms and the routines that we did without thinking. And a good way to get those going again is try to just come back to those really simple shared ways of being together. And dare I say, good manners. Just simply, that's a form of behaviour and interaction that holds respect and concern for the other person's experience. When we're tired and irritable, we use the wrong language, we raise our voice, we barge around, we're all egocentric. If we try and keep good manners and don't raise our voice and keep things calm, we know, for instance, the research in the United States of children and disasters shows that the negative emotional tone in the family is one of the strong points that predicts problems in children. Just to try and keep the emotional tone calm. And when you're doing that, you're making a really significant contribution to try and not suppress it all, but just try and hold it for later. Have a talk about it. Recognize you're irritable. Help each other as a couple to, do things calmly and sort your problems out in a calm manner. The question is sometimes asked, when do I know there's a problem? Well, go back to the idea the wheel's starting to wobble. And I would say, if the car is not able to drive conveniently down the road, we need to stop and look what's wrong with it. So it's not about feeling terrible, feeling depressed, feeling sad, feeling angry and irritable and so on. It's about if those things are sufficiently strong that they're seriously at risk of interfering with your day-to-day activity. I think that's one of the most important things. If your mood is sufficiently intense that it's sapping your energy, that it's undermining your sense of purpose, then if it just feels too bad, if it's interfering with your work, your family life, or your recreational life, please don't wait, but come forward and get some help. Because we know that people that do that early often only just need a few sessions, a bit of advice, some specialist information, and they can pull it together and off they go. So that's a matter of tightening up the wheels, tightening up the nuts on the wheels before they're even really seriously wobbly. And there's a strong commitment to be available. The services here all sorts of ways to be available for the long term. And it is long term. We want to have it fast, but it isn't going to be fast. It never is. So we've got to pace ourselves to the way it happens, do all our advocacy and representation, so on. But ultimately, we've got to keep pace with the process and make sure that when we get through to the other end, we're healthy, and that we might be a bit sad, but we've learned something really important in our lives that will never go away. So I wish everyone the best through this difficult time, and I look forward to hopefully meeting with you again some stage later in the year. Thank you.